pursuant to our agreement with security in terms of firearms safety, Mr. Rice is going to provide Mr. Haag with a box that has a firearm in it.
That has been cleared.
Yes. I suspect Mr. Haag will clear it again.
It is cleared.
Sir, can you go ahead and state your full name for the record?
Lucien C. Haag, spelled H-A-A-G.
How do you spell your first name?
Lucien.
How are you currently employed?
I have my own consulting firm in Carefree, Arizona, Forensic Science Services.
What does Forensic Science Services do?
I'm involved in firearms evidence examination, primarily the reconstructive aspects of shootings. Distance determinations, long-range shootings, is it a ricocheted bullet? How close was the gun when it was discharged? Those are all reconstructive issues beyond the usual identifying a bullet or cartridge as having been fired from a gun. That's something I also do, but my main focus is the reconstructive aspects of shootings.
What were you asked to do in this case?
Well, a number of things to determine.
And let me stop you real quick. Were you asked to do reconstruction, or were you asked to do more examination and identification?
Identification was a small part of what I did. I did do that with the evidence cartridge case, but primarily reconstruction.
In this case?
That's correct.
Okay. And can you give the jurors an idea of your background and experience, please?
Yes, most criminalists, which is my professional title, have a degree in one of the physical sciences. Mine is in chemistry with some minor in physics. That was obtained in 1963 from the University of California at Berkeley. I then went to California State College at Long Beach, taking 2 more years of study, which included 2 semesters of criminalistics. That course was taught by the primary firearms examiner for the city of Los Angeles. Other courses were mathematics, clinical chemistry, documents examination. That takes me to 1965, when I gained employment with the City of Phoenix Police Crime Laboratory as an entry-level criminalist. I was sent on to Arizona State University, local university, for additional coursework. I started attending meetings of professional organizations that deal with firearms evidence, because that became my main focus in the crime lab. Although I worked in all sections, I later supervised them. My real interest and passion was the ballistics or firearms unit of the laboratory. I left there being the City of Phoenix Crime Lab in 1982, so I was there about 18 years. I'd been doing some private consulting, some teaching at that time. I was an instructor in criminalistics, which included firearms evidence. I started my own company when I left the City of Phoenix. My company became my full-time employer, and I've been working there ever since.
Sir, do you have any professional memberships?
Yes, there are a number of them. The most important one is an organization called AFTE, A-F-T-E, the Association of Firearm and Toolmark Examiners. I'm a longtime member. I became president in 1985 and 86, served on a number of committees. Other organizations include the California Association of Criminalists. That's the nearest regional area. I'm a distinguished member of that organization. I'm a member and fellow in the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, which has a criminalistic section. I'm an associate member in a European organization. That's most of them.
Okay. Can you summarize for us your presentations and publications?
Yes, I'm very passionate about presenting evidence among our peers in the AFTE group. So to date, I've presented, and most of them have been published, about 200 publications over the last 50 years or so. I've authored with my younger son, who you'll probably hear about, a textbook on shooting incident reconstruction, which is now in its 3rd edition, with the unimaginative title, Shooting Incident Reconstruction.
Have you received any citations or awards?
Yes, the AFTE group I mentioned before has voted me Key Member of the Year award several times, distinguished member status. Likewise, the California Association of Criminalists, and they have a fairly uncommon award called the Roger Green Award. That's for historical work, and I'm very interested in history, especially cases that involve the use or misuse of firearms, so I've received that award from the CAC.
And have you been qualified as an expert in the areas of firearm examination and/or reconstruction?
Many times.
Approximately how many times?
Well, over the last more than half a century, 57 years, several hundred times, I'm sure.
Have you been qualified in both state and federal courts?
Yes, I have.
Have you been qualified in numerous states in the United States?
About half of the states in the United States and several foreign countries.
What foreign countries?
Northern Ireland, case in Guam, I think, and in Canada,
Okay.
several times.
Sir, do you have any particular interest or expertise in single-action revolvers or old Western-style revolvers?
Yes, I'm interested in all types of firearms and their mechanisms, but single-action guns are, of course, what we see in Western movies. They're fairly straightforward. They're historic. Sam Colt is a well-known name, and he was an inventive genius, and his firearms to this day are still prized as collector item if you are so lucky as to have an original.
And how did you become involved in this case?
I think it started with a phone call in March of last year where I was well aware of the case. I'd heard about it. I didn't know much about it other than there'd been some sort of a misadventure on a set with a death and an injury. So after that, documents were received. That's where I start every case. I want to read what's known about the case, what the issues are. Interviews were sent to me, a lot of photographs, and ultimately, in July of last year, I went to the local property room with the custodian there, and along with my younger son, Mike, we received, well, I think it inventoried over 50 some items, but some of these had sub-items in them. So that was the beginning.
As a part of the document review that you did in this case, did you review the ballistics report and the case notes from the FBI?
Yes, I did.
Expert?
Okay, is there any objection to tendering I'll ask the court to accept Mr. Haag as an expert in firearms examination and reconstruction.
All right, no objection. Yes, he's such an expert. Thank you.
Sir, so in addition to reviewing the FBI examination report and the case notes, you also took numerous items of evidence into your own possession and performed testing on those items. Is that right?
That's correct.
And was the evidence revolver in this case that I'll refer to as the Baldwin revolver, was that one of the items that you took into your possession and tested?
Yes, it was.
Let's start with the FBI report. Let's go ahead and give me a screen. Mr. Bowles, is Mr. Haag your witness? Do you want to look at these real quick?
Yeah.
Your Honor, I'm going to move for the admission of States Exhibits 130 through 146 and permission to publish with the witness as we move through his testimony.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
All right, states 130 through 146 are admitted and you may publish.
Sir, so we have on your screen States Exhibit 130, but before we speak directly to this, ultimately, did you form an opinion, and I know we haven't gotten there yet, but we're going to, did you form an opinion about how the damage to this firearm occurred?
Yes, I did.
And did you also form an opinion as to the working condition of the firearm when it was received by the FBI?
I did.
Let's start there. What was your opinion with regard to the working condition of this firearm when it was initially received by the FBI?
By various means, I could see that it was in proper working order as designed by the original inventor.
And tell us what you took into consideration in coming to that opinion.
Well, there are several ways. One of them is on my screen. I don't know if it's on your screen or not. It's from the FBI examiner's report, a man named Bruce Ziegler, I believe, who I met.
Bryce, yeah.
But I looked at all of his photographs and notes. And on the left side are the 4 positions that the hammer can have with this gun when it's working properly and undamaged. The top one shows the hammer fully forward and down. That's the way it would appear if you had just fired it or even dry fired it. The next picture down looks pretty much the same, but it's not. The hammer is about 1/8 of an inch rearward, and now it has engaged an internal mechanism, a safety notch. So now the hammer and firing pin cannot reach a live cartridge. The third picture down is the loading position, also known as half cock. The previous position could be called, and is often called, quarter cock. At that half cock position, the third picture down, the cylinder, which capable of holding 6 cartridges, is now free to rotate. Prior to this, in the upper 2 pictures, it was locked and secured by a small latch that we can't see in these pictures. The final picture, and the most important one, the hammer is at the full cocked, ready to fire position. You can now see the firing pin in the hammer, that it's fully rearward, and it's staying there. That will be important later.
And if you would, because describe for us what the firearm is that you have in front of you. Is that this exact gun?
It's the brother to the evidence gun. Same make, model, caliber. It's just not the evidence gun.
And would you demonstrate for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury the different positions, and also specifically the half-cock position and the rotation of the cylinder?
Sure. Well, I checked it, but again, just so everyone feels as comfortable as they're going to be around a firearm.
Hang on just a second.
You should probably stand in the middle.
Yeah, do you want to stand? And
Sure.
That would be great.
I'm left-hand dominant, so I have to explain that. The hammer is fully down. If there were a live cartridge in this gun, the firing pin would be resting right against it. So this is an unsafe carry position if it were a loaded gun. It would also be the position if I had just fired it. There would be a spent cartridge. The firing pin would be deep into the primer of that cartridge. You can also see that the trigger is back. Now when I pull it, there, that's the safety position. Very little movement, but the hammer is now about 1/8 of an inch rearward. The trigger has just popped forward, so it's got an internal spring that is resetting. Cylinder is still locked up, cannot rotate. Now when I pull it to the load position, you may have seen the cylinder rotate already. It's free to rotate now. The little latch that I mentioned, which we can't see, has been pulled down by that motion. There's a loading gate here on the side that's opened, and this is where I would either remove fired cartridges or place live cartridges up to a total of 6. After loading it, fully loading it, I close that gate. And I have 2 choices. If I'm ready to shoot, I'm going to cock it. And if I've decided what I'm going to shoot at is to be shot at, pull the trigger. Hammer falls off of a ledge, a little notch. Actually, it's more of a step on the hammer. So now we're back to where we were a moment ago. If I'm going to fire it again, pull it all the way back. Hammer stays in position, which we saw in the photographs, which again is important because when we get to the damage that occurred with the gun, the hammer won't stay there. If I'm going to let it down, if I'm going to render this gun safe, I decide I'm not going to shoot. I do have to pull the trigger, but I get my thumb firmly on this spur. Pull the trigger, let it down. Once I get past the halfway point, I can let go of the trigger and it engages a safety notch again. So there's all the steps. It's called a single action. You've probably heard that term a couple of times because pulling the trigger accomplishes one single thing. It fires the gun.
In terms of that loading gate and the loading of the gun, if you were to show me the primers and the head stamps of the rounds that you have in the gun, and we know that there are none, but we're just going to play pretend. Show me how you would show me what's in that gun.
Well, I bring it up, no one down range.
Here, maybe we go this way so that
I bring
where's
the
loading gate?
hammer to
Yeah.
half cock.
We want to show the jury.
Let's go over here. So they can see.
Oh.
There we go.
She used a term, it's an industry term, the head stamp. It's what's written on the cartridge, and in the middle of which is a primer. So if she wanted to see, or any of you wanted to see, are there fired cartridges in here? Live cartridges, all 6? I just rotate the cylinder. And we go a couple of times around, see if there are any empty chambers or fired cartridges or live rounds. If we want to take them out, if they're live, you just dump them out. If they're fired, you need this ejection rod here to knock a spent cartridge out because it's expanded.
So if you were to show me the rounds that you have in the gun in this manner, I can only see the head stamp and primer of one cartridge at a time.
That's right, in this view from behind the gun with the gate open.
Thank you, sir.
I can take my seat?
Yes. So, when you, oh, thank you. Is there anything else that you can think of from the documents that you reviewed that went into, that contributed to your opinion that the gun was in a proper working order when it was received at the FBI?
Yes, the examiner was able to fire at least 12 live cartridges for comparison purposes to recover bullets and fired cartridge cases. The gun had to be in working order to do that. Had it been in the condition I later found it, you wouldn't have been able to do that.
And the condition that you later found it, can you just describe what was wrong with it when you took it into evidence? And I'm going to pull an 8 up. This is going to be an exhibit that's already entered into evidence, Exhibit 97A.
It had been partially disassembled. It was in a gun box with some ties.
I'm working on it. Hang on. Pardon me, where's my... Okay, if you can use this as an aid, and sir, your screen, you can use it to draw lines and all kinds of stuff.
So it's a touch screen.
It is, if you need some assistance.
This is one of the FBI, of the many FBI pictures, and you're looking at 3 parts of the gun. The obvious one's the hammer.
And get rid of it.
Do I erase it? Hammer's pretty obvious. Here's the firing pin. I really wanted to make a circle. It's making arrows. Okay, we're looking at the hammer, and I'm really pressing hard. The hammer, the important part of the hammer are these notches you can see here. There's 2 clear notches. Something goes in them. Well, one of them is the safety position. Next one is the load position. The one that's very difficult to see, and I almost obliterated it, is down at the bottom of my circle. That's where the full cock step would be, but it's been peened, P-E-E-N-E-D. It's been knocked off, rounded off, and is full of very rough tool marks. The piece that would fit into each one of those is the trigger, and the trigger is the black piece here, but the tip of the trigger, industry is called the sear, S-E-A-R. That's the piece that goes in those 3 locations. And it really rests on this step when it's in the full cock position. So that's somewhat tenuous, and the pulling of the trigger causes it to slide off, the hammer to fall. There's a little piece in that circle I just drew. That's the broken off sear of the trigger. So it's an incomplete trigger. And finally, the object up here has 2 names. The company that makes this reproduction gun calls it the bolt, B-O-L-T. I've always called it a cylinder stop latch. It was the thing that was securing the cylinder in the safety position, in the full cock position, but not in the loading position. The left side of that goes up into the notches in the cylinder for those previous positions and drops down and allows the cylinder to rotate in the load position. So looking at those both photographically and in person, I could see that the full cock step or notch on the hammer was broken away, beaten away, or knocked away. Kind of hard to describe it if you don't see it under the microscope. And the sear was broken off, and the stop latch, the little wings, there's 2 pieces that protrude out. That also was broken, and the gun can't work in the normal fashion if it had been that way on the movie set.
And based on your document review, do you have an opinion about how the bolt, the trigger sear, and the hammer were damaged? What took place that caused that damage?
The hammer had to be in the full cock position, and 1 or more substantial blows, impacts to the hammer, because it's just sitting, the sear and the trigger and the full cock notch are just sitting there engage with each other, and it's a small area. So if you give a substantial blow, one or more, to the back of the hammer, it is stressing that area, and it will finally, and did, finally fail. And I can see under the microscope a lot of very rough tool marks where it's just rolled over and rounded off. It's no longer a step. It's a rounded area which cannot retain the trigger even if it was intact.
What's your understanding of the circumstances of the blows you're talking about?
As I understood reading the examiner's notes and report, it was an evaluation of whether this gun was prone to accidental discharge by an impact to the hammer.
We're gonna look at a few other photos here. Before I take this photo down, I'm gonna pause.
Councilor Prout.
Mr. Haag, let's shift gears for just a moment. Based on everything that you reviewed and also the examination and the firing of this gun that you yourself participated in, have you seen any evidence that the full cock hammer notch was filed or modified to allow faster shooting?
No.
Thank you, sir. I'm showing you what has been marked as State's Exhibit 134. Can you explain to the jury what we're looking at here?
Yes, you're looking at two triggers from a Colt reproduction single action revolver. The lower one is from probably the very pistol that's here today. It was a new Pieta Colt single action that my younger son owns. So that's the way it should look. The one above is the broken, damaged trigger, and the tip of the sear is not even present in this picture. So that area is missing. Just trying to get the hang of this. It's right there.
And I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 137. Can you tell us what that is?
Yes, this is a view through an instrument called a stereo microscope to which a camera's been attached. And you're looking at a putting back together, so to speak, like a broken teacup, where I'm putting the two parts together. And all that roughness you see there are manufacturing marks. Those aren't breakage marks, but just when they made the part on the one side of it, it's been machined. And under the microscope, you can see those lines. So if you look at that, you can sort of see the contour agrees. And if we put them, my son and I put them right back together, you just see a faint line. So we deliberately pulled them apart a little bit so you can see they're two pieces, not just a crack in a piece.
So just to be clear, what we're looking at here in State's Exhibit 137 is the trigger with the top part of the sear and then the part of the sear that was broken off. Is that right?
Yes, two pictures back. If you remember, there was a little piece of metal off to one side and the trigger with a piece missing. That's what you're looking at here. Those have been put back together or brought close together under the microscope.
And this is just a demonstration that the piece of the sear that broke off fits back on to the trigger sear mechanism, sort of like pieces of a puzzle.
Yes, it's not ground off or rounded off, it's snapped off, it's broken off.
State's Exhibit 138, can you tell us what we're looking at here?
Again, you're looking through the microscope at the evidence hammer as I saw it, and this area, try to do this a little better, that's where there should be a nice right angle step, and there isn't. It's just rounded off toward the right. The other two are the load notch, and they truly are notches, and the quartercock or safety notch. But the circled area should not look like that. There's no step there at this point.
And it's your opinion that that was shaved off during the aggressive testing at the FBI?
Yes.
State's Exhibit 139, can you tell us what we've got here?
Council, may I ask, were these introduced? Were they admitted
Yes,
earlier?
I believe so. I asked to admit.
Oh, 130 through 146, okay, thank you.
Got it. Go ahead, sir.
We're looking at 4 hammers in sort of an oblique view. 3 of them, my younger son and I provided. I bought 2, he took 1 out of the revolver you saw here today. But the one here is the evidence hammer. And if you look across at the other 3, you can see that they're visually quite different. And again, the evidence hammer has very little left for the sear of even an unbroken trigger to rest on. So that was the purpose, just to show what do these things look like, and does the manufacturer make them in a reproducible way And of course, they do.
Thank you. State's Exhibit 135.
Yes, this is the, again, company calls it the bolt. I know it as the cylinder stop latch. You, as a user, would only see that part. Comes up and down inside the frame of the gun to lock the cylinder up or to release it. The rest of it's well within the gun, and it's being operated when you pull the hammer back, and it's broken. One of the little ears or tabs is broken off.
Can you hold up your exemplar revolver and just show the ladies and gentlemen of the jury the area of that bolt that you have circled? Can you just show the ladies and gentlemen of the jury the notches on the cylinder where that engages?
Sure. You might be able to see the notches here. They come around. That's where the latch goes in. You can't see the latch unless we disassemble the gun. If you were to have this in the jury room and you were to look through here, there's a little bit of daylight. I can see it pop up and I can hear it go into the battery, so to speak. But otherwise, you will not see it. You just know if it's working or not.
And show me, I'm sorry, can you show me the notches on the cylinder where?
Sure. Let's bring it to the load position.
Let's walk around so that they can see it just a little bit better, especially since it's a dark metal, it's hard to see.
I'll just walk down the line. My finger's right at one of them.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to shift gears real quick because then we're going to have to move to another machine. Were you also asked to examine some ammunition in this case?
A lot of ammunition, yes.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 131. Do you recognize that?
I do.
What's that?
It's a disassembled .45 Colt cartridge with a type of bullet known to the shooting community as a semi-wad cutter bullet. The red material is just a lubricant that can be any color. So it's not the red color that's important, it's the shape of the nose of this bullet, called a semi-wad cutter.
And what's this at State's Exhibit 132?
That's a much better picture of the contents of that packet. The cartridge case is on the right. The semi-wad cutter cast lead bullet. This bullet was made in a bullet mold. Is right there. You can see the truncated cone is the $10 description of that nose shape. It was going to be a cone, got truncated at the top. Again, semi-wad cutter bullet is the other name for it. And in the vial is the propellant, and that's a propellant very well known to me called Trail Boss. It's designed and intended for cowboy action shooting and lead bullets in traditional firearms like this. And
sir, what was your understanding of the source of this cartridge? And when I say source, in terms of the relevant locations in this case.
This was one of a number of cartridges like this that came from a supplier in Albuquerque of ammunition, dummy cartridges, so on.
Do you know if that was PDQ props?
Yes, that I recognize the name.
Thank you. And State's Exhibit 133, what's this?
This is one of 5 live cartridges that were recovered by investigators from this scene. You can probably see that the powder looks very different. It's smaller, it's darker, it doesn't have that little donut shape. Bullet style is also very different. Setting the blue lubricant aside, this is a round nose bullet with a truncated nose. So it would have been completely round had the bullet mold not had this flat area to produce this flat appearance. And this is pretty much like a traditional bullet from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And again, a cartridge case, .45 Colt cartridge case is on the left. So if we have a live primer in that cartridge and put it all back together, it's a live cartridge, not a dummy.
So Mr. Haag, if I went to a gun store and I bought a box of ammunition, let's say I'm buying .45 Colt caliber ammunition, would that box perhaps include what we're seeing in 133 and also what we're seeing in 132?
From professionally made purchased ammunition, you're not going to see an M&M situation or mixed bullets. They're all going to be the same weight, style, same kind of propellant, same head stamps, and of course the same kind of primer. They can come either nickel plated or plain brass.
And the live ammunition that was taken from the set of the movie Rust, can you describe the characteristics of that live ammunition in terms of the head stamp, the primer, those just sort of exterior identifying?
Yes, if we could go back to the other
Sure.
exhibit with the blue bullet, there's one of them. You can't see the primer, of course, because the cartridge is turned sideways, but it's a nickel-plated primer. It looks like chrome, shiny nickel-plated. If it were back-loaded, you would only see the top, basically half of the bullet. The part with the blue lubricant would be inside the cartridge case. And the powder, the gunpowder, in the little vial would, of course, be inside that cartridge. So putting it all back together, you'd have a complete round of ammunition. The head stamp, you've probably heard that term plenty of times, so I don't need to define it, for these cartridges was Starline. It's a very well-known manufacturer of cartridge brass. They do not manufacture loaded ammunition, at least not as I sit here today. So Starline's well-known. I use it myself. I'm a hand loader. That's what you would see if we turned that cartridge up so you could see it.
And what color was the primer on the live ammunition?
I think I said it, but I'll repeat it. Nickel-plated, shiny.
I apologize, thank you. Let me ask you, can cartridges and ammunition that look exactly like this be purchased at local gun stores?
In the gun stores I go to, yes.
And at my request, did you obtain some and send me some pictures?
Both my son and I bought boxes of commercial 45 Colt ammunition with lead round nose bullets with a flat meplet is the fancy word, M-E-P-L-A-T. It's the flat spot on the nose. The powders weren't necessarily identical to what we see here, but they're a type of pistol powder.
States Exhibit 141, what's this?
This is the outer box of one of those, which I believe my younger son Mike bought this one. HSM is a small ammunition company. You can probably read, it's meant for cowboy action shooting. It's a popular contest with traditional single action shooters. And those cartridges have the Starline head stamp and red bullets with flat noses on them.
I'm going to get there. Let's go to States Exhibit 140. What's this?
Well, you can see 4 of the cartridges and their head stamp in an oblique view that they don't say Starline, but that's their symbol. 2 little asterisks with a line going between them. And then, of course, the cartridge designation, 45 Colt, and nickel primers, shiny nickel-colored metal.
And States Exhibit 143.
This further characterizes the weight. In the United States, bullets are weighed in an archaic term, frankly, called grains. 7,000 of them in a pound, but 250 grain is the traditional classic weight of the Colt bullet. So this company, HSM, now tells us you can expect if you were to shoot one of these bullets and collect it and put it on a balance that weighs in grains, it's going to be around 250 grains, plus or minus a grain or 2 from the shooting and impact process.
So the grain comes from weighing the bullet.
That's right, just the bullet, not the cartridge or the powder.
And just as an aside, did you examine the projectile from this case, the projectile that was removed from Mr. Souza?
Yes.
And are you aware of whether or not that projectile was 250 grain at the time that the FBI had it and the time that you had it?
Yeah. No, it had lost some weight. It started out life, in my opinion, as a 250 grain bullet, but it suffered reduction from probably 2 sources. A heavily fouled bore, in other words, the gun barrel through which this passes had a lot of fouling in it from a black powder substitute. I was able to duplicate that phenomena, so the bullet now, like squeezing toothpaste, gets squeezed down a little bit and it gets some rubbed off. Plus it went through 2 people and it struck bone. If you've seen pictures of it, or if you do later, it's got a lot of impact damage from striking bone. So for those 2 reasons, it weighed about 240 grains, as I recall. 10 grains is not much, and it was now reduced in diameter to about 44 instead of 45.
But in your opinion, that projectile started out as a 45 Colt 250 grain bullet.
Yes.
And let me go to State's Exhibit 144. What's this?
One of the cartridges from that box of ammunition that you saw earlier has now been removed, so you can see it's nice and shiny and new in the brass. And the bullet is, again, not too unlike the one with the blue lubricant in it. It's round nose and it's truncated, so it has that flat front called a meplet.
And just for completeness, State's Exhibit 146.
Yes, it's just a closer view of one of the cartridges from that HSM ammunition company.
So this cartridge has the same physical characteristics in terms of the shape of the bullet, is that right? And we're comparing them to the live rounds found on set.
Yes.
And they both have brass casings, is that correct?
Yes,
They both have the Starline brass head stamp,
that's right.
and they both have nickel-plated primers.
Yes, yes, they do.
Thank you. That's fine. Okay, thanks. We'll just need to make a note of it like you did. I appreciate that. Let's connect over here. Sorry, guys. Mr. Haag, at my request, did you meet me in August at the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Department? August of 2023.
Yes.
And can you summarize for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what the exercise was that we engaged in that day with, also I think your son was assisting us.
Yes, he was. We had been requested to reassemble the evidence revolver with the broken parts, mainly the hammer and the trigger, or with I think just the broken hammer with the knocked off full cock step, to see if it even could be cocked and would retain the cocked position.
And while we were there, did we take some videos?
I'm sorry?
Did you record some videos while we were there?
Yes, we actually did it a number of times after we reassembled it, with and without the cylinder in the revolver, and videotaped, I think, 6 runs in one session and 3 or 6 in the other.
We're only going to watch 2.
Okay.
Okay. Let's do it. I'm going to get them started once you give me the screen. What's that? Thank you, Judge. Where are we?
147.
This is 147. Okay, hang on. Bear with me here. We're ready.
This is the
Let me stop it.
Move into evidence, states 147 and 148, any objection?
It's actually going to be 147 and 147A.
All right, any objection?
no, you're
All right, so 147, 147A is admitted, you may publish.
Let me turn that volume down. I'll play State's Exhibit 147. Hang on. I took it down too far.
the following exceptions.
Is there an issue with audio?
Describe what we've done to put it back in operating condition.
All the parts on the revolver are original with the following exceptions. This is a new trigger and sear, same piece. It's the original hammer. It does also have a replacement bolt or cylinder catch. Otherwise, as mentioned, every pin, screw, spring, whether that's the main hammer spring or the flat spring that operates the trigger, are original to the revolver.
So what we did is just as a recap. This is the Baldwin gun. Is that right?
That's correct.
And the trigger is a new unbroken trigger. Is that correct?
That's also correct.
And the bolt that we saw in the photos that had lost an ear, is that replaced?
Yes.
But the hammer that's in this gun is the original hammer from this gun. Is that correct?
But damaged, yes. And that was the whole point. Does the damage, how does it affect the operation of the gun if we isolate the hammer?
So this is the hammer that you believe was damaged at the FBI.
Yes.
Full cock position. Hammer falls and is captured at the half cock position. Again,
So what did you ask your son to do? He's the one holding the gun.
I asked him to go through the normal cycle. If you produced this firearm and cocked it, and expected the hammer to stay cocked until you pull the trigger, it will not, because that full cock step or notch has been rounded off. The perfectly brand new trigger cannot retain the full cock position. The hammer falls to what you just saw, and it falls to that half cock notch. So the good trigger and its sear drop into that notch, preventing the gun from firing. So that's intentional. That's what Mr. Colt intended. If somehow the gun got worn and the hammer started to drop when you cocked it, it's going to get captured. And if it gets past that point, it'll be captured by the quarter cock notch.
Demonstrate the positions of the hammer, normal positions.
From full down where the firing pin is protruding from the breech.
Can you see the firing pin protruding from the breech in this video?
Yes, when I first described how this gun works for you, the hammer is fully down. So it's either just fired a cartridge, or this would not be a good way to carry this gun with live ammunition, because that firing pin is resting right against a live primer if there was a cartridge in this gun. And it wouldn't take much of a blow. You don't have to hit it hard. Just drop it from a few inches in this configuration and it'll fire.
To the cock. From here, the trigger will not allow the hammer to drop because of the shape of the notches of the hammer. From the half cock or load condition also, pulling the trigger does not drop the hammer.
And the cylinder is now out of alignment with the axis of the bore.
And then
Tell us what you mean there, and why is that important in gun handling? You indicated that the cylinder is now out of alignment with the axis of the bore.
Well, the two things you just saw was starting to bring the hammer back all the way. Went through the safety notch, cylinder's still locked up. But when you get to this position, the cylinder now rotates a few degrees, more than a few, about 10 or so. If somehow you were able to fire this gun from that position that you're looking at in the screen right now, there's going to be a real disaster because the bullet can't go down the barrel. Maybe half of it might, but the other half is going to be jammed up against that area. That's really hard to do. And you're probably going to blow the cylinder apart. You may get injured. So there again, what Mike and I were demonstrating is it's called a slip off. If you're trying to cock the gun and you lose your grasp on it, the hammer falls, that safety notch captures it. And now if we get this far, it still is going to be captured, but somehow if it got past that, the safety notch, you're going to have a damaged at the minimum or a destroyed gun and probably an injury to yourself.
And in this position where the cylinder is no longer aligned with the axis of the bore, does the firing pin hit the primer every time?
No, it can hit it just at one side, and primers are designed to detonate, and it's a proper term, with basically a central hit in the primer. If you get off to one side, you'll often have a misfire, a failure to fire. And if it gets any further than that, it hits out in the head stamp area, it doesn't hit the primer at all. The more that cylinder rotates out of phase.
which normally would be caught when released, drops. And with lateral pressure, both directions, this one slipping the thumb off to the right side of the hammer, this one slipping the thumb off to the left side of the hammer, all catch on the half cock as long as the trigger.
Why the example of the hammer slipping?
Why would we do that example? It can be a misadventure with this kind of firearm. One of them I described, you're trying to cock it and you lose control of it. If you haven't pulled the trigger, what you just saw will happen. Nothing. It'll capture the hammer. Similarly, you can cock a gun and then decide, as I demonstrated, I want to let the hammer down. You don't want it cocked. You're going to have to pull the trigger. You're going to have to coast that hammer down with a good thumb on this area called the spur. And when it gets past the safety notch, the proper thing is to let go of the trigger and the safety notch will capture it once again.
All right, this is August 24, 2023.
All right.
Mike Haag and Luke Haag at the Santa Fe Sheriff's Laboratory. No,
Let's look at State's Exhibit 147A.
this is August.
Just tell us before we play it, what are we looking at here?
This is the same evidence revolver. You're now looking at the other side, and we've removed the cylinder and the cylinder pin.
Is everything still the same though? We've got damaged hammer, everything else works.
Yes, everything else is the same. I think we wanted to see the stop latch working at one point.
We'll go ahead and play this.
2023, in the property room of the Santa Fe Sheriff's Office. And Mike, you're on to describe what we've done to the evidence gun.
So it's the item 1 revolver, the Pieta. Original parts include all the pins, screws, grip, the original hammer. It has the original hammer spring as well as the original flat spring that operates the trigger. The trigger is a replacement trigger, so the top of the sear is a functioning original piece. And as said, original hammer. It does have a replacement bolt as well. Otherwise, all parts are original.
Hammer's in the fully forward position at this spot. The normal full cock position, hammer falls, doesn't hold, but the half cock notch captures it. Let's do it again.
I'll take it all the way down. We can see the quarter cock notch also functions, half cock functions, and then all the way to full.
And you can see the stop latch finally in that view. It's this little piece right there. It went down when it got to the half cock and then came back up when it reached the full cock position because that locks the cylinder in alignment with the axis of the barrel.
And again, when it was in the full cock position and it was released and it fell and was caught at half cock, that was why.
That was as designed. That's what it should do. In that situation, the cylinder would have been aligned, but in a way it doesn't matter because it wouldn't fire.
No, I'm talking about when your son pulled it into the full cock position and it didn't stay there. Why didn't it stay there?
Again, the former full cock notch or step has just been beaten off. It's just rounded. There's no step there any longer. So it'd be the same as the edge of this witness stand. If it were round, I couldn't do that, slip off.
I'm just going to go slowly through the video so that we can see the bolt that you were referring to. So I'm starting this video at 1 minute 9 seconds.
There you can see the stop latch right now. It's up because it's locking the cylinder if the cylinder were in the gun. And it's still up because we're falling from the full cock. If we'd come from the hammer down to this very position, it lowers itself so we can rotate the cylinder and load and unload the gun.
Just for completeness, we'll finish playing it.
Hold, but the half cock notch captures it. Let's do it again.
I'll take it all the way down. We can see the quarter cock notch also functions, half cock functions, and then all the way to full.
And it fails to hold, but is captured at the half cock.
I'll apply some lateral pressure to the hammer as I release it as well. That was to the right. This is to the left. And of course, because of the notches on the hammer, pulling the trigger at the safety notch or the load condition, those do not release the hammer.
I think that covered.
So based on the experiment that we did with this gun back in August of 2023, even if the hammer of the gun was damaged on October 21st of 2021, would the trigger have to be pulled for the gun to fire?
Two things. Yes, the trigger would have to be depressed or pulled. The hammer would have to be at the full cock position, and it can't be damaged because it would do what we saw here, and what you just saw here would not fire the gun.
So hypothetically though, even if it were damaged on October 21st, the operator, that being Mr. Baldwin, would have had to have pulled the trigger.
If you could get the hammer to stay at the full cock position, that's the difficulty to overcome.
Which it doesn't want to do.
It will not do.
Okay. And did you have an opportunity to examine the spent casing from the Rust movie set in this case?
Yes, I did.
Did you make any conclusions about whether or not that spent casing was fired from this gun?
Yes, I did.
What's that?
I'm in agreement with the FBI examiner. I was able to match it under the microscope. There are tool marks on the breech face of the gun that print themselves, literally stamp themselves into the primer. And there were a number of test-fired cartridges that the Bureau prepared, that I prepared, and under a specialized microscope for this purpose, I could see a very nice identification. So, in my view, the fired cartridge was fired in this gun. And then I went on to look at the shape, location, and depth of the firing pin impression as the next important question.
And let's go ahead and talk about that. Everything that you learned from the firing pin impression and what that tells you about the position that the hammer of the gun was in at the time it was fired.
It tells me two things: that the cylinder was locked up and aligned, So the hammer had been pulled all the way rearward. If it had not, it wouldn't be in alignment from what I've shown you. Secondly, the depth of the firing pin impression told me from doing test fires, multiple test fires, and measuring all the 12 that the FBI lab conducted, that it was a cartridge that was fired from a full hammer fall, not from an effort to let the hammer down and slip off or any other misadventure, but rather a normal hammer fall from the full cock position.
One final demonstration for us, if you would take your revolver out and come in front of the jurors. And you can stand right here so that you can speak into the microphone. So just for completeness, I would like for you to demonstrate to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, using this exemplar revolver, the position that what had to have happened on October 21st, in your opinion, for this gun to fire. Let's show them rather than give them a verbal description.
It had to have a normally functioning, undamaged hammer. The handler, in this case Mr. Baldwin, had to get it to this position. If he let go of the hammer, it would stay as you see it here. Pulling the trigger will fire it. Now you can do that as quickly as you cock it, or you can wait minutes, hours. But when I do that, if there's a live round in there, it's going to fire. The firing pin impression is going to have the full depth from this. And I've done it, if somehow I did this, I'm trying to let it down, and I let it slip, it either won't fire at all, or it makes a much shallower firing pin impression. I did that multiple times with the evidence gun and with the exemplars. I own several of these. My son owns several of them. So I could distinguish by the depth and the centering. This was a normal hammer fall from the full cock position.
So had the gun fired a position less than full cock, lower than full cock, in between full and half or half and quarter, you would be able to tell that by the depth of the firing pin impression. Is that correct?
What I call a slip off. If you're trying to let the hammer down and you get about the halfway point and it slips, you also have to pull the trigger, by the way, it'll be a much shallower firing pin impression because it doesn't hit the strike, doesn't strike as hard. And from the quarter cock, if you're trying to put it in safety position and you lose control of it, again, you have to pull the trigger. It just makes an indentation in the primer, doesn't fire at all.
Thank you, sir. If you can take your seat. Sir, in the what we call the discovery, in the documents and information that you reviewed, did you have an opportunity to review some videos of Mr. Baldwin on set in the church pulling the gun out of his holster?
Yes, I did.
And are you familiar with that type of holster?
Yes.
Are you familiar with this type of gun?
I'm sorry?
Are you familiar with this type of gun? I think you've indicated you are.
Yes, I think I own 6 or 7 of them.
Is there anything particularly difficult or dangerous about pulling this style revolver out of that style holster, in your opinion?
Not so long as you don't load it, or if you do load it, that you don't cock it and pull the trigger. Otherwise, it's safe. It's an easy movement to make. I have no problem with how to do that.
When you say it's an easy movement to make, can you think of anything the gun might get caught on, or anything that could create danger?
Not realistically, again, the hammer secures itself well to be drug across clothing, and if it fell without a trigger pull, and the trigger's well shielded with a trigger guard, but if somehow the hammer got pulled off the full cock position, you've already seen what's going to happen. It gets captured at the half cock position.
All right, thank you. I'll pass the witness. Mr. Bowe, I'll have you disconnect us.
Lunch break. Please don't talk among yourselves or anyone else about the evidence received here in court. We'll be back at council. What time do you think? Council?
Yes, Your Honor, I apologize.
Well, it's 11:38. You want quarter of?
Sure.
Yes, thank you, Your Honor.
So quarter of one. Quarter of one. Do I have that right?
Yes, you have that right.
Thanks. All right. And since you're a witness, don't talk to other witnesses.
I understand.
Yeah.
All rise.
Powders, if you shoot a 30.
To ever point.
All right, you may be seated.
I was just told that there's more there.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, I wanted to ask you first off, I think your conclusion, what you stated earlier, is that based on your expert review of that Baldwin revolver, the shooter had to have fully cocked that weapon and pulled that trigger to cause it to fire. Is that? Oh, I'm
Can't
sorry.
hear.
I apologize. Let me start over if it's okay, Your Honor. Sir, if I can ask that again, I think your conclusion, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that the Baldwin revolver that you examined in your expert opinion, that the shooter had to have fully cocked that weapon and had to have pulled that trigger all the way, or pulled the trigger to fire it.
Yes, on the first part, I bifurcated my answer in the report. Either pull the trigger, which I regard as a volitional act, or have already depressed it. If he
Yes, sir.
already depressed it, the very instant he let go of the hammer, it would fire.
So, sir, for example, if Mr. Baldwin were cross-drawing that weapon and had his finger in the trigger guard, and then he pulled it and it had it fully cocked and it slipped and let go, would that fire that weapon?
Only if he had the trigger pulled or depressed. They're similar, but I make a slight distinction between it being depressed versus pulled.
So, sir, so either way, that shooter had to either have it depressed, have his finger in the trigger, or pull that trigger for that to fire.
And have it cocked.
And have it cocked.
Fully cocked.
Fully cocked.
Yes.
Okay. I noticed earlier when you were doing a demonstration with the jury, you exercised extreme muzzle discipline, I'm going to call it. You learned that, correct? Not to ever point that weapon at an individual, a human?
Long ago.
Yes, sir. Been around guns a long time?
I have.
And one of the most important rules, and I saw when you walked down, you had it either down, up. It was never pointed at a person. That's one of the most important rules of gun safety, isn't it?
I agree.
And sir, another rule that I noticed when your son was on that video, when you were demonstrating, you never had your finger in that trigger guard. Is that another rule you learned from a long time ago?
Well, we were demonstrating something there in which the trigger
Yes.
saved the gun from firing. If we had depressed it, of course, it wouldn't be a useful demonstration.
No, and I understand. My question wasn't good. You never put your finger in that trigger guard until you were ready to pull that trigger in some manner.
Yes.
Now, with regard to the cross draw, I know you've been around guns for a long time, but with regard to the cross draw, would you agree that somebody that was not familiar with that draw would need to have training on that draw?
You'd have to have some understanding of where the firearm is, how the holster works, whether it's got a safety strap or not, and then, of course, get it out of that area and swing it around, as was shown in the videos that I've looked at of Mr. Baldwin.
Yes, sir. And did you see the video where when he pulls it out, his finger is in the trigger guard? Did you see that?
I certainly did.
And again, that can be very dangerous, sir, based on your expert conclusion, if he has that fully cocked, correct?
And it's loaded and fully cocked. Yes.
Yes, sir. And so when you watched that video, did you make a determination as to whether he should have drawn that with his finger in the trigger guard?
It's been a while since I've looked at it. I was trying to decide a couple of other things. If that's the evidence gun, I was satisfied it was because of the plain bare metal hammer. And then, of course, looking at, can I really determine if his finger's inside the trigger guard but not on the trigger itself? I could never resolve that because of the camera angle.
And in any event, you should not have your finger on the trigger in that cross draw.
Well, it doesn't matter what it's a cross draw. It's if you're going to cock the gun, which he did after it's out. I do remember that. When it's out of the holster, you can see him cocking it. It's now clear of the holster. I'm back to, I can't tell if he's already got the trigger depressed or it gets pulled later.
Sir. And with regard to your conclusion, I want to make sure I was clear on that. I know that I don't want to use the word critical, but you didn't think that aggressive testing by the FBI was a good idea?
I didn't think it was necessary in this case, given the context. What are the issues in the case? In my mind, it was never an issue that the hammer got struck by anything or that the gun got dropped.
And so you didn't believe that the FBI even needed to do that test?
From my viewpoint, no. It
Okay.
was not a useful or necessary test to strike the hammer of the fully cocked evidence gun.
Did you also say that you did not find any damage to that weapon that would have prevented it from firing as designed? And I'm talking about not after the FBI, but prior. Is that your conclusion?
Yes, if the hammer were replaced and the trigger replaced and the bolt. It was a perfectly functioning, authentic replica of a classic firearm.
Sir, and in your inspection of that weapon, that Baldwin revolver, did you see any modifications that would have changed the firing characteristics of that weapon?
No, not at all. In fact, I went through 12 other revolvers. 9 of them are Pietas. And I took them all apart with the help of my younger son, Mike. And we looked at the sears, the triggers, the full cock notches, and they were all equivalent. You could have swapped them out because they're carefully manufactured parts. So that's how I addressed and answered that question in my own mind.
So other than the FBI testing, breaking those components, you didn't see any other evidence of modification or damage?
I did not.
Sir, with regard to the rounds that you were talking about, the Starline brass is used by hand loaders at times. Hand loaders use Starline brass, is that true?
Yes, that's their primary market. I'm one of their consumers. Small ammunition companies like the box of ammunition that the prosecutor showed earlier have also used their brass. Remington, Winchester, they of course have their own.
So, and can you tell the jury a hand loader, if they can use any type of primer, any type of powder, any type of bullet in a case, right?
No, that's definitely not true.
What is a...
Well, let's start with the primer. That's the spark plug in your car. It's the spark plug in ammunition. There are large pistol primers and there are small pistol primers. The Colt cartridge requires a large pistol primer. There are also rifle primers that have the same dimensions, but they're harder and usually have more explosive in them. The same way there are small rifle primers. So you got 4 types. Then they could be plain brass, if that's your pleasure for aesthetics, or nickel plated. And I've seen them both ways. So we got 4 types and 2 finishes. There are even some that are custom for bench rest shooting and other exotic competition, but those are the 4 main. The powders, yet another thing. They're powders that are specifically manufactured for handguns. You've got a big bore and a heavy bullet that's got to be accelerated in a short distance. So those powders have to burn very fast and produce their energy. Rifle powders, if you shoot a 30-30 or a 30-06, you couldn't take the powder that's in one of your rifle cartridges and put it in a pistol cartridge and get it to work. It'd basically fizzle or squib. They burn it. It's like sawdust, sticks, and logs. Powders burn at different rates for shotguns, pistols, and rifles. So there's a lot of thought that's gone into this over the last century and a half of how you make all this come together to not blow up the gun, to achieve the desired pressure and velocity, and of course, produce an accurate shot.
Yes, sir. And so did you have any evidence when you looked at the live rounds from the rust set that those were hand loads or those were some other type? Did you determine that?
Well, they're in Starline brass, which is sold for hand loaders. But as I said, a commercial manufacturer can buy Starline brass, just as you saw in that one box. The bullets look more amateurish to me. In fact, I have that same bullet with the blue lube, and it's a cast bullet. It doesn't come in cartridges. So I don't have a definitive answer on any. They were virgin cases. That means they hadn't been fired previously and then reloaded. They were shiny inside. So they were first time assembled, and the powder, their physical forms, just as I've mentioned, look like a powder called Bullseye, which is probably the oldest pistol powder around. It's very popular. I use it myself. It's normally associated with hand loaders, but it doesn't stop the industry from buying a ton of it and loading a few million rounds.
So you didn't make a definitive determination, but those rounds appeared amateurish, which would be more like a hand load. Is that fair?
Yes, it has kind of a demeaning character to it. I pride myself on my hand loads, and they looked fine, but they'd already been disassembled. So I didn't get to see the quality of the crimp, and just where the crimp was made, that's where you hold the bullet in the cartridge case. I wished I'd seen them before they were disassembled.
Disassembled. So when you looked at it, it did appear, I'm just trying to establish, it did appear more likely to be a hand load.
Yes.
And if we could have, if I may approach the witness.
Are you going to mark that?
This is State's Exhibit 110. This has already been admitted. I'm going to do my best with this, Mr. Haag. I hope you can see this.
Yes, I can.
Do you see this is State's Exhibit 110 that's been introduced? Have you ever seen this photo?
Yes, I have.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me get that. So, Mr. Haag, on the right, that you're looking at right now, I have it under it. What is that type of powder?
It's a pistol powder. In my opinion, it's one called Trail Boss. That's a brand name designed for cowboy action loads in handgun, centerfire handgun cartridges. And its characteristic shape, as I say, it looks like little donuts or tires if you magnify it. And it's a dull gray. It's also what's called a single base powder. I use it myself. It's an old friend. It works well.
Sir, and now I'm going to move this over and I'm going to show you this other type of powder. And what do you call that type of powder?
Of the many physical forms, it's called disc flake. That's with a hyphen, disc flake. It's little flakes in the sharp shape of discs, like little gray hockey pucks under the microscope. And without a scale, I couldn't compare that any further to, say, Bullseye or some of the other disc flake powders.
And now I'm going to try to zoom in here. Do you see in the middle of the ones you just described, you see that donut looking shape right in the middle?
I see it. I don't see it as a powder particle. It's something in the holding device.
By holding device, what do you mean by that?
I don't know. I didn't have benefit of having this in my hand to actually empty it out, as I recall. So I don't know what it is. It's not powder. That's all.
You don't think it's powder?
I'm convinced it is not a propellant or powder.
But you don't recall that particular thing when you looked at it or when you had it? Or what did you just say? I didn't understand.
If I looked at it, I was again firsthand. I was again interested in the propellant as to whether I could identify it on the basis of morphology. And I didn't get anywhere beyond it's a disc flake powder popularly used in pistol cartridges, handgun cartridges.
Sir, as part of your work in this case, did you ever see the photographs from PDQ Props from Seth Kenny's business?
I know I saw a number of photographs after a production of materials there, search warrant, I suppose you'd call it, and a lot of the ammunition. Plus the FBI did a lot of x-ray images of cartridges from that facility.
Did you remember the way that place looked in terms of its organization or disorganization?
Only vaguely.
All right. And we may show you some pictures of that, but you never went there personally.
I have not been there.
And you've had no contact with Seth Kenny yourself.
That's also correct. I don't know the man and not met him.
With regard to the rounds on set, did you or inspect all of the rounds? For example, there's been 250 dummy rounds. Did you go through all of those?
Over a period of 5 days, yes.
And did you go through all of the live rounds you said?
Yes, definitely. Okay. Looked at all disassembled, but 5 rounds.
And other than what you told us, anything else about those live rounds? You did tell us the blue loop. Any others that you investigated that you determined about those?
Well, I probably said earlier this morning, those are hard to cast, meaning the lead has been hardened. It's not dead soft lead like you get out of an x-ray machine. Cast bullets, there's another way you can make bullets that the manufacturers do, but casting with a mold, bullet mold. And yes, I'm now miscalled. The propellant in the disassembled live rounds looked like the powder I mentioned, Bullseye. And I didn't see that in other sources in this case.
Now, sir, can you tell a jury what a light strike misfire is, if that term's familiar to you?
Yes, I'd usually separate the terms, but let's just start with a misfire is a cartridge fails to fire for some reason. A light strike could be one of those reasons. That means the hammer didn't fall its full distance, or it was retarded by something. It was going to fall, but something got caught up in it. Or the example I gave earlier, and I did it with the actual evidence gun, pull the hammer back with real ammunition, pull the hammer back to the quarter cock, that little distance where the safety would set, but I had the trigger depressed, and then let the hammer fall. That would make it'd be actually hard to see, a little tick mark, T-I-C-K, a little tick mark in the primer, but it wouldn't fire it.
Observing that after that happened, if you observed that round and you could see that little strike in the primer, is it true that round could still go off the next hit?
Yes, if it didn't fire and a primer had a tick mark, one of these little light indentations in it, and you put it back in the firearm and drew the hammer all the way back, it's going to fire.
And sir, one other area you mentioned that the gun barrel, Baldwin revolver, it was dirty.
Well, it had to be dirty when the evidence bullet went down the barrel.
And let me just ask you, does it take some time for an individual to properly clean a gun that's been firing black powder?
Whether black powder, I saw no evidence black powder was used in this case, but I know what you mean. There's a substitute called 777. Acts like black powder. They both leave a lot of residue in the gun barrel, and it can be difficult to get out, especially if you don't know what you're doing, because it's largely water soluble, and modern powders, like you just showed me in the picture, are not water soluble. So you need to know this is 777 or black gunpowder, and I've got to get this stuff out. You're going to have to scrub it out with hot soapy water is the best way, and then dry the gun barrel out.
And I appreciate that. I know you operate a business. Were you paid or compensated in this case for your work?
For my time, of course.
Yes, sir. And how much have you been compensated?
Well, my wife handles the bookkeeping, so I don't know for sure. But there's been quite a few hours. As I said, 5 days just looking at all this evidence alone. Then another when I came over here in July to look at the clothing. And then in August for the videos you saw. So there's 5, 6, 7, 8 or so days.
And what's your hourly rate?
$350 per hour.
Okay, and I thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Mr. Haag, did you look at all of the disassembled live rounds from the set of Rust?
Yes.
Did any of the primers on those live rounds have those tick marks?
No.
And just to be clear, when we were looking at photos earlier, the photo of the ammunition that came from PDQ Props, you described that bullet as a semi-wad cutter.
Yes.
And can you definitively say that the live rounds from the set of Rust were homemade reloads as opposed to the HSM brand that we looked at on the photos that you and your son purchased?
I wouldn't demean that ammunition to that degree. There's it's subtle, but if you shoot all the time and load ammunition, I recognize them as, in all likelihood, hand loads. I wouldn't describe them as shoddy or poorly made, or sometimes I'll see dents in cartridge cases and the bullet's been improperly seated. So nothing wrong with them. They look like perfectly suitable hand loads. I've seen prettier. I've sure seen a lot worse.
Are you, I just want to be clear, are you testifying to the jury that you don't believe that those rounds that were found on the set would have come from a small manufacturer like HSM?
I can't rule it out, but the ammunition I've purchased in .45 Colt from various manufacturers and those that my younger son Mike has purchased have a higher quality. The bullets are slicker, shinier.
And you were asked some questions on cross-examination about gun safety and Mr. Baldwin having his finger in the trigger guard of that gun. You recall those questions?
I do.
Based on your review of the evidence in this case, is it your understanding that Mr. Baldwin was told that the gun was cold or inert before he put his finger in the trigger guard?
Yes, it's my understanding from reading the documents, the call cold gun was given, meaning there's a gun on the set, but there's nothing in it that's going to fire. No blanks or, of course, live rounds.
And the dummies in this case that rattled, you examined some of those, didn't you?
Yes, I did, a number of them.
Do you mind my asking, sir, how old you are?
83.
And, sir, with your 83-year-old ears, were you able to clearly hear the rattle?
Not always.
Not always.
Especially in my right ear.
Do you think that's an issue with your hearing?
I thought it was subtle even when I listened with my good ear, my left ear.
The rattle was subtle.
Yes.
So in order to hear that rattle, you have to listen pretty closely, right?
Yes, and it gets more complicated. Some of them had one pellet in them, others had 2 or 3. So now you've got the advantage if you happen to pull one that's got 3 in it, better opportunity to hear it rattle.
Sir, are you familiar with the term inertia bullet puller?
Sure.
Can you tell us what that is?
Yes, it's a very simple device. It looks a little bit like a hammer, only it's clear plastic. It's got a cap, and you put usually a live cartridge or maybe one that's failed to fire. Anyway, it's a cartridge. It's got a bullet cartridge case, primer. Put it in this device, and you hit it on a hard surface. good old Isaac Newton works out for us. The hammer stops and the heavy bullet keeps on going. Now, it may take 3 or 4 hits, but you separate the bullet from the cartridge in a non-destructive way. So you get the bullet, you get all the powder, and you get a cartridge case. It's pretty routine if we want to know what's this ammunition loaded with, how much powder, what kind of bullet, because we can't see all the bullet when it's in the cartridge case. So it's a common tool. I think I have 2 or 3 of them.
So the inertia puller is a device that is designed to disassemble live ammunition. Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. I don't have anything else.
All right, thank you, sir.